Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would talk about this little subject, this little topic that has kind of interested me over the years, because this really is a topic that has been going on for the past, I don't know how many years, pretty much ever since Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Canelo Alvarez fought, I believe, all the way back in 2013, I believe this fight was. Well, a lot has really changed ever since that time several years ago when it comes down to it. Floyd Mayweather Jr., as we know, ended up retiring 50-0. His last professional boxing fight was against Conor McGregor. Now, of course, Conor McGregor was not an actual professional boxer, but it still counted as a professional boxing fight, so whatever when it comes down to the overall. And Canelo Alvarez has kind of transformed himself, at least in most people's eyes, certainly in my eyes, as the number one pound for pound fighter. Which, if you were to tell me several years ago that Saul Canelo Alvarez would eventually become the number one pound for pound fighter, I would not believe you. I, once upon a time, did not think that Canelo Alvarez had it within him to become the number one pound for pound fighter. It took me a long time to actually respect Canelo Alvarez's ability. I think when I finally started to notice major improvements with Canelo Alvarez, or when I said overall, like, wow, this guy really could become one of the all-time greats. I think the first time to where that kind of crept into my mind was when he fought Miguel Cotto. Because Miguel Cotto, even though he was a little bit undersized for that fight, and you have certain people overall that say, well, Miguel Cotto, he was a lot older than all that sort of stuff. It is true that he was older, and maybe you would say that that's not the best version of Miguel Cotto, but let's not try to twist things around here. There was a lot of people that looked at that as a 50-50 fight. So it is what it is. And Miguel Cotto, he pretty much got outclassed in that fight. Canelo Alvarez was able to outbox him. He looked very impressive in that fight. That was a Miguel Cotto that was, rebuilt by Freddie Roach. And Miguel Cotto, he looked like a slick fighter. Miguel Cotto is not just some brawler. Miguel Cotto can really box, when it comes down to it. And Canelo Alvarez was able to completely outbox him. So you have to give Canelo Alvarez a lot of props for that. It is what it is. That's really, the major time when I said, wow, this guy really is starting to improve. I think the bottom line when I said, wow, this guy really could become the potential number one pound for pound fighter, I think that's when I seen him in the rematch against Gennady Golovkin. I actually predicted Canelo Alvarez to beat Gennady Golovkin in the rematch because I figured that Canelo Alvarez, he saw in the first fight that Golovkin more than likely just wasn't going to be able to knock him out with one shot. And Golovkin does have a little bit of a weakness going on the back foot. So Canelo Alvarez, I knew, was probably going to try to push him back. And Canelo was faster than Gennady Golovkin. Also was a better combination puncher than Gennady Golovkin. They both were very accurate counter punchers. And Canelo was going to have the speed advantage going on the inside. So I knew that was going to be a very uphill battle for Gennady Golovkin. And it proved to be a very uphill battle for him because I thought Gennady Golovkin lost the second fight, even though it was very close. But when it comes down to it, man, Canelo Alvarez has really transformed himself into the number one pound for pound fighter. Well, as we all know, if you watch boxing in the 2000s and also in the 2010s, you know that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was the number one pound for pound fighter in the 2000s and also in the 2010s. So here's the question. Who is the greater fighter out of these two overall? And would Floyd Mayweather Jr. be able to defeat this version of Canelo Alvarez? Because a certain amount of people always ask, or not ask, but they always say that, well, Floyd Mayweather Jr. wouldn't be able to beat Canelo Alvarez today because Canelo Alvarez is at his best. He fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. when he was too green and all that sort of stuff, I've heard a multitude of narratives, so I'm going to try to put my best version of a logical and objective standpoint on this. So, first of all, when it comes down to it, when I look at Canelo Alvarez, I want to say this. I think when I take a look at Canelo Alvarez's skill set, his dominance, his everything, I think Canelo does have the potential to become a top 20, top 10 boxer of all time when it comes to one of the all-time greats. I think he has the real potential to do that. I could see Canelo Alvarez easily being the number one pound for pound fighter for several years straight in the 2020s. I could see him doing that. We'll have to see what he does. I wouldn't be surprised if someone else took over his throne. But when it comes down to it, I would not be, let's just say, I would not be shocked if Canelo Alvarez was able to do that. So we'll see what happens. Personally, if you were going to ask me the question, Do I think that Canelo Alvarez is ever going to surpass Floyd Mayweather Jr. in terms of greatness? I think that that's going to be very hard to do. I think that that's going to be extremely difficult because of how dominant Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, all the champions that he fought, and the fact that he did dominate Canelo Alvarez at that point in time. It kind of reminds me of the Tom Brady, Patrick Mahomes situation that just happened this year. If you watch NFL football, you know what I'm talking about. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers with 43-year-old Tom Brady, he just recently defeated Patrick Mahomes. I can't remember what his age is. I think he's like 26, something like that. But when it comes down to it, Patrick Mahomes was at his absolute peak. Tom Brady is still at a very decent point in his career, surprisingly, for the age of 43. But when it comes down to it, no one expected Tom Brady to be good, as good as he was this season, besides maybe a couple of people. So for the people that are going to argue later on that Patrick Mahomes, let's say he ends up winning a multitude of Super Bowls, let's say he even ends up winning 4 or 5 Super Bowls, there's going to be a certain amount of people later on that argue that Patrick Mahomes is greater than Tom Brady. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be a very uphill battle because in that individual matchup, and a couple of the individual matchups when it happened, Tom Brady was able to get the better of Patrick Mahomes. He was able to win those matchups. And I think a lot of people are going to look at the same thing when it comes to Floyd Mayweather Jr. and so Canelo Alvarez. Now, here's also the question. Was Canelo Alvarez too green for that fight? Was Saul Canelo Alvarez, too young and all sort of stuff? That narrative that, a lot of the Canelo Alvarez fans love to push. What I'm going to say is this. I think that Canelo Alvarez is a greater fighter today than what he was back then. But I still think you have to give Floyd Mayweather Jr. a lot of credit for defeating that version of Canelo Alvarez because that version of Canelo Alvarez is still an A-plus fighter, in my opinion. Canelo Alvarez, at that point in time in his career, was a champion. He defeated Austin Trout, who was an undefeated, decent fighter when it came down to it. He had 40-something fights, I believe, at that point in time in his career. So the excuse of, Canelo Alvarez was just too green, I don't think that that's necessarily going to work because Canelo Alvarez was one of the more dominant fighters in the world. Now, once again, do I believe that Canelo Alvarez is a better fighter today? I absolutely believe that he's a better fighter today. I think that, I think that Canelo Alvarez is at his absolute best today. The best version of Canelo Alvarez that I've seen was against Callum Smith. That is the best version of Canelo Alvarez that I've personally ever seen. That's probably the most impressive performance that I've ever seen Canelo Alvarez put on in his career. Here's also another question because there's certain channels out there that like to promote this narrative. Floyd Mayweather Jr., he was a grandpa, when he beat Canelo Alvarez. He was an old man. What do you think he would have done to him, in his prime? Well, let's just say this. Floyd Mayweather Jr., I can't remember how old he was. I think he was like 36 years old when he ended up defeating Canelo Alvarez. I could be wrong. Someone let me know. But when it comes down to the overall bottom line is this. Floyd was pretty much at his peak when he defeated Canelo Alvarez. It's not always about age. A lot of people, like a lot of people when they take a look at the Gennady Golovkin Saul Canelo Alvarez match, they'll say, Gennady Golovkin was like 36, 37 years old. Yeah, but he was a good 36 and 37 years old. Gennady Golovkin really didn't start to have a decline until after the Canelo Alvarez matches. You can tell when the fighter is usually done in their career. And let's be fair, Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, you can argue, at the best point in his career at that time. I didn't start to see really slippage from Floyd Mayweather Jr. until probably a little bit of the Marcos Maidana fights, the first Marcos Maidana fight. But I think the second fight he still looked pretty good in. I think that he just was not expecting a certain amount of the pressure that Maidana was going to put on him. And some of the skills that Maidana showed, because Maidana is not, just a complete brawler. He does have some skills. So I don't think Floyd Mayweather Jr. was necessarily expecting that, but he still was able to adjust enough to get the first fight, I guess. In the second fight, he looked a lot more dominant. I thought that he won it clearly. So even there, you can say that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was potentially at his best. But when I remember that performance, Floyd Mayweather Jr., he completely dominated Canelo Alvarez. And some people may disagree, but if you know boxing, you know what you watched. Floyd Mayweather Jr. dominated Canelo Alvarez. He completely gave him a boxing lesson. It is what it is. Floyd Mayweather Jr., to be honest with you, when I remember watching that fight, I can't really remember a significant round that I gave Canelo Alvarez. I think at one point in time, when I first watched the fight, I think I scored it like 12-0 for Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think it was like that far apart. It was really hard for me to give Canelo Alvarez a round in that fight. Floyd Mayweather Jr. I thought was so dominant in that fight. So it is what it is. I'd have to rewatch it today, but last time I watched it, which was so long ago, yeah, it was really hard for me to give Canelo Alvarez even a single round in that fight. But when it comes down to it, if Canelo Alvarez were to fight Floyd Mayweather Jr. today, do I think that he would beat Floyd? If they both fought each other at their absolute best, what I'll say is this: I think I would still bet on Floyd Mayweather Jr. That's just me personally. I think that I would still bet on Floyd Mayweather Jr. because I think Canelo Alvarez is a tremendous fighter. But Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, is debatably the greatest fighter probably in boxing history, and some people may disagree. Floyd Mayweather Jr., when I take a look at him, he really what makes Floyd Mayweather Jr. special, in my opinion, it's not just his athleticism, it's not just his speed and overall a certain amount of other things. Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s boxing IQ and his ability to adjust and adapt to his surroundings is really what makes him a tremendous fighter. There's certain fighters that you just look at that and it's just very natural with them. And Floyd Mayweather Jr., that really, I've never seen another boxer have his ability to adjust to certain attacks in the ring the way that he was able to. And that's something that Floyd Mayweather Jr. deserves a lot of credit for. I've never seen a fighter be able to adapt or come up with multiple game plans the way that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was able to. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is probably the most intelligent boxer that there has ever been in boxing history, and that's a big part of the reason what makes him such a great fighter. Once again, it's not just his athleticism, it's not just his skill set. He sees things in the ring that some other people just don't plain see. And when I take a look at Canelo Alvarez, I think when it comes to peak v peak, Canelo Alvarez versus Floyd Mayweather Jr., I don't think that a peak Canelo Alvarez, when we talk about him right now, and a peak Floyd Mayweather Jr., I don't think that fight would happen. Because Canelo Alvarez, when we talk about him at his absolute peak, he's probably at least a natural 160 pounder. And if we're talking about a fight that would happen, there certainly would have to be a weight drain. So if you're talking about a fight to where Canelo Alvarez is not weight drained, kind of like he was, I believe, in that fight against Floyd Mayweather Jr. by a couple of pounds. If you're talking about a Canelo that is not weight drained, I don't think that fight would ever happen in the first place. Because Floyd Mayweather Jr., I mean, he rehydrates at about 150 pounds. Canelo's a big boy, man. He rehydrates at about 185. Like, that's where Canelo Alvarez rehydrates. He's a very big guy when it comes down to the overall. So 150, 185, I'm trying to think. That's like a 35-pound difference, ain't it? When it comes down to it, not always the great at instant math. So someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's like about 35 pounds when it comes down to it. So I just, if it were peak v peak, I don't think that fight would ever really happen in the first place unless there would be a weight drain. And I don't, let's say if some people would want to see a rematch between these guys happen now, I don't think that it would ever happen because, first of all, I don't think Floyd wants to come back. I think that he's smart enough to know that his body's starting to get to him and that he's starting to decline. And when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, I don't think that he would give in to a certain amount of the demands that Floyd Mayweather Jr. would try to give him. I don't think Canelo Alvarez would weight drain at this point in time. I don't know if he can anymore when it comes down to it. I don't think Canelo Alvarez at this point in time in his career can make 154, and I don't know if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is going to fight somebody that, would rehydrate that high as Canelo Alvarez does. I don't know, unless there would be a rehydration clause. But once again, if we're talking about peak v peak at their best, I do not think that fight would even happen. But it is what it is because I think that there's too much of a size difference. But let's say the fight somehow were to happen. Who would I personally bet on peak v peak? I still would bet on Floyd Mayweather Jr. I still think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is a better fighter than Canelo Alvarez. I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is just smarter than Canelo Alvarez. And it's not that Canelo Alvarez is not a smart fighter. I see Canelo Alvarez make certain adjustments in certain fights. He's a very slick fighter. Floyd Mayweather Jr. has gave Canelo Alvarez a certain amount of credit for his style because he believes that Canelo Alvarez also has a decent amount of slickness to him, which he is correct. Canelo Alvarez is a very great fighter, and I think once again that he's the number one pound for pound today. But I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr., when we talk about it, I think that he's just on another level when we talk about it. That's just my opinion personally on this situation. I'm not sure what many other people think about it, but or what you guys think about it, I should say. But when it comes down to the overall, that's pretty much my opinion on this situation. I thought that I would talk about it because I've been hearing this conversation so much for the past I don't know how many years. So I thought that I would talk about it. If you're asking me who is the greater fighter between peak v peak, Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Canelo Alvarez, I think that for sure has to be Floyd Mayweather Jr. And if you're asking me who I think would win in a fight, peak v peak Canelo Alvarez now, or Floyd Mayweather Jr. at his absolute best, whatever you count him to be at his absolute best. I think you can have an argument that the Floyd Mayweather Jr. that actually fought Canelo was him at his absolute best. You can have an argument for that. Maybe the Floyd that fought Cotto, maybe the Floyd that fought Diego Corrales. I don't know what you count Floyd at his best. Personally, I would say probably the Canelo Alvarez fight, because he was so defensively responsible at that point in time in his career. But then again, maybe you can say the Ricky Hatton fight, because Floyd didn't necessarily have all the hand problems there. I don't know. It's really up to you. But when it comes down to the overall bottom line is this. I would still pick Floyd Mayweather Jr. probably in a match over Canelo Alvarez if this would have been Floyd at his peak versus Canelo Alvarez now. I still think I would have picked Floyd Mayweather Jr. to win the fight. But it would have been probably a 60-40 fight, because Canelo Alvarez is so big and he does have a decent skill set. So it is what it is. But I would have bet on Floyd Mayweather Jr. That's just my opinion on this situation, and that's pretty much about it for me today. Let me know what you guys think on the situation, and I'll talk to you all later.